Step away from that Footlocker and put your hands where I can see them. That was the first thing Officer Kurt Rennick ever said to me. And he said it the way a man says a thing he has said 100 times before to people who never once said it back to him. Flat, bored, already certain of how it would end. I did not flinch. I have trained myself over a lifetime not to flinch, because a flinch is a sentence in a language these men read fluently, and they read it as guilt. So I set the small brass key down on the lid of the trunk, gently, the way you set down something that matters, and I raised my hands to the level of my shoulders, palms open and empty, and turned toward him so he could see there was nothing in them, and I turned slowly on the ball of my foot to face him. 40 years of being a black woman in America had already taught me the exact choreography of survival, where to put my hands, how slow to move them, how to keep my chin from lifting into anything he could call defiance. And 30 years inside the machinery of law enforcement had taught me the rest, the part they never write in the manuals, that the calm you show a frightened, armed man is not for his comfort, but for your own continued breathing. It was a gray Saturday morning at the Fairmont Self-Storage on the industrial edge of the city, a place where the roll-up doors line a concrete corridor like the teeth of some long sleeping animal, and the light came down flat and colorless through the high dusty windows and lay on everything without kindness. I had come there alone, in a faded charcoal university sweatshirt with a frayed cuff my father used to tug at when he wore it, in old jeans gone soft at the knees, in running shoes, to move my late father's things. And what Officer Kurt Rennick did not know, what he could not have known, because he had never once bothered to look at another human being long enough to learn anything true about them, was that the woman he was ordering down onto the cold concrete of Unit 114 was the sitting police commissioner of that very city, the highest-ranking civilian authority over every uniform, every cruiser, every badge in the department, including the tarnished one pinned crooked to his own chest. In that moment, he was giving orders to the person who had signed the document that gave him the power to give orders at all. But I said none of that. I lowered my voice into the register I use in crisis, the one that has talked panicked rookies back from ledges and walked grieving mothers through the worst nights of their lives, a voice built to slow a room down, and I said, "Good morning, officer. This is my storage unit. My paperwork is right here on the lid, if you'd like to see it. May I ask what this is about?" He did not answer the question. Men like Kurt Rennick never answer the question, because a question assumes a conversation between equals, and equality was the one thing his whole posture had been assembled to deny. He was maybe 35, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who has confused the size of his body with the size of his authority, and he came up the corridor with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt and his chin tilted back so that he could regard me down the length of his own nose, as though I were something he had found on the bottom of his boot. He glanced past me into the open unit, at the neat stacks of my father's boxes, at the reading lamp I had wrapped in a moving blanket, at the old olive-drab Footlocker with the hand-painted stencil flaking on its side, and I watched a story assemble itself behind his eyes, a story I could tell he had told himself many comfortable times, in which a woman like me in a place like this at an hour like this could only be one thing. "We got a report of break-ins out here," he said. "Storage theft. People cutting locks, hauling out other folks' property in the early hours. And here you are. No car I can see. Dressed like that. Digging through a locker." He let the word people hang in the air a half beat too long, the way certain men do, so you understand precisely which people he means without him ever saying it plainly enough to be quoted back at him in a room with a stenographer. "So let's you and me start with some ID," he said. "And then you're going to open that trunk and show me what's inside." I have spent my whole career learning the difference between an officer who is afraid and an officer who is enjoying himself, and Kurt Rennick was enjoying himself. I could hear it in the little upward lift at the end of his sentences, the small music of a man who believes the morning has handed him a gift. My driver's license was in my back pocket. My department credentials, the gold shield, and the laminated card that would have ended all of this in 4 flat seconds, were folded into the very same wallet, an inch from my fingers. And I want you to understand that I made a choice in that corridor, a deliberate one, with my hands still in the air and my father's flag still in the dark behind me. And it is the choice this entire story turns upon. I did not reach for the shield. I reached instead for the ordinary license, the plain one, the card that says only my name and my address and offers no title, no rank, no armor of any kind. I did it because standing there in my dead father's sweatshirt with my palms open to a stranger's suspicion, I understood that I was, for once in 30 years, seeing my own department the way the people I had sworn to serve saw it every single day of their lives. From below, from the wrong end of a pointed finger, stripped of every advantage but the plain, unaccompanied truth. And I decided, in that half-second, that I would not rescue myself with a badge. I would let Officer Kurt Rennick show me, and show whatever cameras were rolling, and show God if he happened to be watching a storage lot on a gray Saturday, exactly who he was when he believed no one could see him and no one could touch him. So I drew the plain license out with 2 fingers, slow and visible, and I held it toward him at arm's length, and I said, "My name is Iris Vaughn. I've rented this unit for 6 years. Everything in it belongs to me, and I would like to know your name and your badge number, officer, before we go one step further." He took my license the way a man takes something he has already decided is counterfeit, pinching it by one corner and holding it out to the side, tilting it under the flat gray light, and turning it this way and that, and his lip had curled before his eyes had even finished the first line of it. "Iris Vaughn," he repeated, and he made my own mother's chosen name for me sound like the opening of a lie, like the first move in a con he was too clever to fall for. Sure it is, and I'm supposed to just believe this is real. You have any idea how many fake IDs I pull off people out here in a month? He did not tell me his name. He did not tell me his badge number, which is required, which every recruit learns in the first week of the very academy that I myself help fund and oversee and shape, that you identify yourself when a citizen asks, that the number on your chest is not a secret, but a promise. And the omission told me more about the kind of officer he had been permitted to become than anything he could have said. Then he dropped my license. He did not hand it back to me. He opened his fingers and let it fall, so that it clattered off the lid of the footlocker and skittered toward the edge, and I had to bring my hands down out of the air and stoop to catch it before it hit the concrete, which was of course the whole point of dropping it, to make me lower my hands, to make me bend. And as I caught it, he said, "Open the trunk. Now, or I'm adding obstruction to whatever else I find in there." A small crowd had begun to gather the way small crowds always do, drawn by that low frequency of trouble that human beings can feel in the air before they can name it. An older couple 2 units down had stopped loading a hand truck and stood watching with the frozen stillness of people afraid that watching itself might be a crime they could be charged with. And a young man in a reflective safety vest, Marcus, the weekend attendant, 20 years old, with a laminated badge on a lanyard and a clipboard tucked under his arm, and no earthly power over anything at all, had come out of the front office and was hovering at the mouth of the corridor, his phone already half raised, his thumb trembling over the dark glass. I caught his eye for a single second, and I gave him the smallest nod I own, the kind you could deny under oath, a nod that lived entirely in the eyes. And that boy understood me, God bless him, because he lifted the phone the rest of the way to his face, and he began to record. I want it set down on the record forever, in whatever ledger the world keeps of these things, that a 20-year-old kid in a reflective vest who made minimum wage had more courage in that corridor than the armed and salaried man wearing the shield. "Officer," I said, and I kept my voice level and warm and slow, because I have learned across 3 decades that calm is the one weapon they never expect you to be carrying, and it is the only one they cannot take off you. "I am going to comply. I want you to watch me comply. But I need you to understand what is inside this footlocker before you open it, because it is not stolen property. It belonged to my father. He passed 4 months ago. He was a soldier. This locker went with him to 2 wars, and it came home both times, and everything inside it is the last of him that I have left in this world. So I am going to open it for you now, and I am going to ask you, one person to another, to treat what is inside with some respect." I crouched down. I fit the brass key into the old brass padlock, the very lock my father snapped shut with his own hands the last time he ever closed that trunk, and I felt the tumblers give with that familiar heavy click I had not heard since I was a girl kneeling beside him, and I lifted the lid. Inside, folded into a perfect triangle beneath its plastic case, was the flag they had draped over his casket, the white stars pressed into the blue. Beside it, in a felt-lined cigar box, were his medals. I will not stand here and list them all, but there were more of them than a man that humble had any business keeping quiet about for a whole lifetime. There were his letters home, bundled in coarse twine, the ink gone brown as old blood. There was a photograph of him at 22 years old, grinning with his whole entire face, his arms flung around the necks of two men who did not come home from where that picture was taken. And there, laid carefully on top of all of it, was the folded dress uniform he had first asked to be buried in and then, at the very last, changed his mind and decided he wanted his grandchildren to be able to hold in their hands and know the weight of. Kurt Rennick looked down into 40 years of a good man's whole life, and he was not moved. That is the part one still turn over in the dark at night. Months later, the part that will not go smooth. He was not moved. He reached past me, uninvited, his forearm brushing my shoulder, and he took the triangle of the flag up in one hand and lifted it out and flipped it over, this way and that, as though a decorated soldier's burial flag were exactly the sort of thing a thief would hide contraband beneath. And when he was done pawing at it, he did not set it back down where it belonged. He let it drop. He let my father's flag fall out of his careless hand onto the bare, filthy concrete of a storage corridor, and he said, "Yeah, we'll see whose all this really is." And he bent and began yanking the letters loose from their twine. I did not raise my voice. I have sat across a table from enough shattered people to know that the loudest grief there is the silent kind, the kind that makes no sound at all. So I only knelt there in the dust, and I gathered my father's flag up in both my hands, and I pressed it against my chest, and I looked up at the man standing over me, and I said, very quietly, almost tenderly, "You are going to regret dropping that. Not because of who I am, because of who he was." He should have heard it. There was a warning buried down inside the softness of that sentence, the way there is a warning inside the stillness of the air, just before the whole sky opens up, and any officer with the instincts the job is supposed to require, the instincts we claim to test for and train into them, would have felt the ground quietly shift beneath his boots. But Kurt Rennick heard nothing, because contempt is a kind of deafness, and he had been going deaf for years, one closed complaint at a time, until the silence inside him was total. He unclipped the handcuffs from the back of his belt with a practiced flick of the wrist. "Stand up," he said. "Turn around. Hands behind your back. You're being detained while I sort out whose property this actually is. I want to be very careful here, precise as a surgeon, because I have read 1,000 use of force reports in my life, and I know exactly how the truth gets quietly sanded down in the retelling, how a compliant woman becomes a struggling suspect between the incident and the paperwork. So let me be exact. I did not resist. I did not so much as stiffen. I set the flag down gently on the lid of the open footlocker, out of the dirt this time, laying it flat where it would be safe, and I rose to my feet without hurry, and I turned to face the corrugated steel of the roll-up door, and I placed my own two hands behind my own back, and I said, clearly, evenly, for the record, for the phone, for the frozen couple 2 units down, and the shaking boy with the lanyard, and whatever future courtroom this gray morning was already hurtling toward. I am not resisting. I am complying under protest. You have not told me your name. You have not told me your badge number. You have not articulated a single specific crime. You have searched my private property without my consent, and you have damaged an item of profound personal value to me. I am a compliant, unarmed woman, and I am telling you plainly, so there can be no confusion later, that you are making a mistake you cannot yet begin to imagine. The cuffs went on too tight. They are always too tight when a man wants you to feel them, when the tightness is itself part of the message, and I felt the cold steel bite down over the knob of my wrist bone and stay there, and I breathed through it. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, the same breathing I have taught to trembling soldiers and to new widows in the worst hour of their lives, and I did not give him the small sound he was fishing for. He keyed the radio on his shoulder, and I heard him report. In that flat performative cadence they slip into when they know the tape is running, and they are speaking as much to the future as to dispatch. Central. I've got one detained at Fairmont Self-Storage. Unit 114, subject uncooperative, possible storage theft, running ID now. Uncooperative. I had done everything but hand him a signed and notarized confession to crimes I had not committed, and I was uncooperative. That single word, radioed out across a channel that fed directly and permanently into the dispatch logs of the very department I ran from a corner office 40 floors up, was the first thread of the rope he was quietly braiding for himself, and he braided it with a tradesman's easy hands, without a second thought. Because he had done this so many hundreds of times before, and it had never once in his life cost him a single thing. That, I have come to understand, is the true crime. Not the one hot, cruel morning of one small man's contempt, but the 1,000 quiet, ordinary mornings before it that had patiently taught him he could. As he pressed me against the cold, ribbed steel of the door with the flat of his hand, I let my mind go where it goes when my body is somewhere it cannot escape from. I thought about my father. I thought about how he came home from his second war and put on a different uniform, a transit worker's gray, and drove the number 9 bus across this same city for 29 years without missing more than a handful of days. I thought about what he told me the evening I graduated the academy, when I was young and proud and full of certainty, how he took my new face in his 2 big hands and said that a badge is not a thing you own, but a thing you owe, a debt you pay back one honest encounter at a time, and that the day you forget you owe it is the day you should walk in and turn it in on the desk. I thought about how I had climbed, decade after decade, meeting after meeting, precisely so that men like the one now gripping my elbow would one day have to answer to someone who still remembered that debt and meant to collect it. And I understood, with the cuffs cold and biting on my wrists and my father's flag 3 feet away in the dirt of this stranger's fingerprints, that I had climbed all that impossible way and still, it had come to this, on a Saturday, in a sweatshirt, at the wrong end of a badge I had personally sworn to keep honest. And then I understood something else, something that steadied me from the inside like a hand on my spine, that this was not a humiliation. This was evidence. Every single second Kurt Rennick spent proving to the world that a clean, calm, compliant, grieving citizen could be dropped to her knees and cuffed against a door on nothing but a hunch, and the color of her skin was a second the whole broken pattern spent revealing itself in high definition on a 20-year-old's telephone, in this plain gray, unforgiving light, out where at last it could not be buried in a drawer. Behind me, Marcus the attendant found his voice, thin and shaking but there, cracking on the first word and pushing through anyway. Sir, she rents that unit. I check the roster every single morning when I open up. That's her name right there on it. I swear to you that's her. And Kurt Rennick, without even bothering to turn his head, said, "Stay out of it, kid, or you're next." And that boy, God bless him and keep him, did not lower his phone 1 inch. The backup Rennick had called for his own convenience, a second unit to help him process the subject, as though I were a carton to be logged and shelved, arrived 4 minutes later, and it was that second cruiser that undid everything, because the sergeant who stepped out of it and squinted up the corridor was a man named Ray Delgado, and Ray Delgado had stood in my own office not 6 weeks earlier, in his dress blues with his hat under his arm, to receive a commendation from my own hand, for talking an armed and suicidal young veteran into laying his rifle down on the railing of the Halstead Street Bridge at 4 in the morning. Ray came up the corridor at an unhurried walk, thumbs hooked in his belt in the same manner as Rennick's, his eyes doing the automatic professional sweep every good officer runs on instinct. The gathering crowd, the raised phone, the open unit, the cuffed woman against the steel door, and then his eyes climbed to my face and stopped there, and I watched the entire architecture of his morning collapse behind them like a building coming down floor by floor. He stopped walking as though he had walked flat into a pane of glass he never saw. The color went out of him from the collar upward, draining out of his cheeks in real time. "Commissioner Vaughn," he said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle of my name, splitting it in two. In the whole of my life, I have rarely heard a silence as total and as sudden as the one that dropped down over that concrete corridor then, a silence with a weight to it, a silence you could feel settle on your shoulders. Kurt Rennick still had one hand flat against my shoulder blade, and I felt that hand change under the word, felt the fingers loosen, then clamp, then loosen again, as his body labored to solve a problem that his mind was flatly, desperately refusing to accept. "Commissioner of what?" he said, and he tried with everything he had to make it a scoff, to bend it back into a sneer, but it came up out of him instead as a question, small and cracking and young, the voice of a boy who has just heard a sound in the house he cannot explain. Ray Delgado did not so much as glance at him. Ray was staring at the handcuffs on my wrist the way a man stares at the twisted wreckage at the site of an accident he cannot look away from. "Sergeant," Rennick said, louder now, reaching, grabbing after the authority that was pouring out of him and through his fingers like water from cupped hands. This. This here is a storage theft detained. The subject was uncooperative from the jump. I've got it. I've got. And Ray finally turned his head and looked at him and said, very low, almost gently, the way you speak to a man standing too close to an edge, Kurt. Stop talking. Stop talking right now. And the plain fact that a sergeant was quietly begging a patrol officer to be silent, in front of a crowd, in front of a phone, told everyone watching precisely how far and how fast the ground had opened under all of us. I said nothing at first. I have learned across 30 years that when the truth has finally walked into the room and taken off its coat, the kindest and also the cruelest thing you can do is let it simply stand there unhurried and let every person present feel the full weight of it settle. It was Ray who moved first. He crossed the last of the distance to me, and he said, "Ma'am, Commissioner, I'm going to take those off you. I am so sorry. I'm going to take them off right now." And his hands were shaking as he fumbled for the cuff key on Rennick's belt, because Rennick himself had gone rigid as a fence post driven into concrete. And Ray unlocked the cuffs, and I brought my arms slowly forward and around, and I did not rub my wrists, though the steel had wrung them white, and then an angry rising red, because I would not hand the moment that particular small drama, would not let anyone say later that I had performed my own injury. I only turned around, and I bent down, and I picked my father's flag up off the lid of the trunk and held it against me for the second time that morning. And then I straightened up to my full height, unhurried, and I looked at Officer Kurt Rennick, who had by now backed all the way up until his own shoulders met the opposite roll-up door with a soft metal boom, and who was looking at me the exact way a man looks at a wave far too big and far too close for him to ever hope to outrun. "My name," I said, "is Iris Vaughn. I told you that. I told you that with a smile on my face, at the very start of this, before you dropped my license in the dirt, before you searched through my father's grave goods with your bare hands, before you called a compliant woman uncooperative on an open channel that runs into my own building. I am the police commissioner of this city. I run the entire department whose badge you are wearing crooked on your chest. I sign the budget that pays your salary and your pension. And I appoint the Internal Affairs Division that is going to spend the next several months of its working life reading every single word you have ever written into a report." I let that settle over him like ash. I watched him try 3 separate times to speak and fail all 3. "But I am not going to stand here and enjoy this," I said, "because there is nothing here to enjoy. You did not do this to me. You did this to whoever was standing on this concrete before I was, and to whoever would have stood here after me. If a 20-year-old with a telephone and a war hero's daughter in a dead man's sweatshirt hadn't happened to be the 2 people you picked out of the herd today. So put your hands down at your sides, officer, and you stand still, and you understand this. From this second forward, you are not going to say one more word that is not recorded and time-stamped and witnessed. Sergeant Delgado, I want his body camera secured, right now, before anything else. I want the dispatch audio preserved and flagged. And I want that young man's phone." I turned my chin toward Marcus, who had gone paper white and was still, God love him, holding it up, treated as exactly what it is. Evidence. Chain of custody starts now, this minute, on this floor. I did not raise my voice a single time in the whole of it, and I have come to believe that this unsettled every person in that corridor more than any amount of shouting would have, because the world expects a woman who has been wronged in public to burn in public, to give them the fire and the tears they can comfortably file her under. And I had spent 30 long years teaching myself to be a furnace that throws off enormous heat without ever once letting them see a spark. Ray Delgado did exactly as I had asked. He secured Rennick's body camera and bagged it. He radioed a supervisor request straight up the chain to dispatch. And then he walked young Marcus gently through what was going to happen to his footage and why every second of it mattered, treating that frightened boy with a plain human respect that told me I had not been wrong to pin a medal on him 6 weeks before. And while Ray worked, I knelt down one final time at the mouth of the open Footlocker, there on the dirty concrete, and I folded my father's flag back into the crisp triangle he had taught me to make, tucking the last corner in tight, and I laid the bundled letters back in their place, and I set the medal square, and I lowered the heavy lid, and I turned the brass key in the old brass lock until I heard it catch. And I stood back up. And I found, to my own quiet surprise, that my hands were perfectly steady. That is the strange mercy of the whole thing, the part one did not expect. In the moment of the injury itself, I had felt everything, every degree of it, the cold steel and the dropped flag, and the word uncooperative going out over my own radio. And now, standing in the exact moment of my vindication, with the man who had cuffed me pressed white-faced against the far door, I felt almost nothing at all but a great and level and oceanic clarity. Because I already knew, standing right there in the settling dust, that the hard part of this was never going to be Kurt Rennick. The hard part was going to be the plain fact that Kurt Rennick had lasted. That he had been a patrol officer for 9 years in my department, on my watch, drawing my budget's pay, and had somehow arrived at that gray corridor believing all the way down to the marrow of his bones that he could do what he did to a stranger and pay absolutely nothing for it. And the only road by which a man ever arrives at a certainty that total is if the world has been patiently confirming it for him, over and over, morning after morning, for years on end. A man does not learn a lesson like that just one time. He learns it every single time a complaint is filed against him and quietly closed without a call. He learns it every time a tired supervisor sighs and signs off on a report he did not read. He learns it every time a citizen with no gold shield folded in their back pocket is told, kindly or unkindly, that it would only be their word against a sworn officers, and that their word had already lost the race before it left the gate. So when I went back to work that Monday morning, in a tailored charcoal suit this time instead of my father's sweatshirt, in the office on the top floor with the city seal hung on the wall behind my desk, and those same steady hands folded on the blotter, I did not begin with Kurt Rennick's personnel file. I began with the 10 years of files stacked silently behind it. And what internal affairs found, once I had made it unmistakably and personally clear that this review would not be the kind that dies quietly in a locked drawer over a long weekend, was a pattern with a shape as familiar to me as my own face in the mirror. 11 prior complaints against Officer Kurt Rennick over 9 years on the street. Detentions without articulable cause. Searches conducted without consent. Reports padded and salted with that same word, uncooperative, laid down like salt in a wound to season the paperwork. And every last one of those 11 complainants, when we went back out into the city and found them one by one and knocked on their doors, had one single thing in common. Not one of them had possessed a badge, or a lawyer on retainer, or a family name that the system was the least bit afraid of. 9 of the 11 had been quietly discouraged from ever pursuing the matter at all, talked out of it at the front desk. 2 of them had tried, had pushed, had filled out every form, and both of their complaints had been closed out as unfounded by a review process that I now finally understood had been broken and rotten long before I ever inherited the chair. Among those 2 was a young man named Terrence Beale, 22 years old, a community college student, who 2 years earlier had been detained by Rennick outside a laundromat on a Tuesday night, cuffed on the hood of a car, held for 90 minutes, and then released without a charge and without so much as a word of apology, and whose formal complaint had been buried so efficiently, so smoothly, that Terrence himself had come to believe, in his own quiet words, when we finally sat across a scratch table from one another months later, that's just how it goes for somebody like me, ma'am, and there's no use bleeding over it. I have carried that one sentence with me every day since. There's no use bleeding over it. That is the exact sound a system makes when it has succeeded in teaching its own citizens to stop expecting any justice from it at all, and it is a far, far more dangerous sound than any siren I have ever heard in my life. The city's own attorneys, once they had seen the raw footage off Marcus's phone laid down side by side with the pattern buried in those files, understood very quickly that the true exposure here was not one bad incident on one Saturday, but a full decade of them, and they moved to settle the civil claims. Not mine. I want that understood. I filed none, and I would file none, but Terrence Beale's and one other man's, for a combined sum of $675,000 of the public's own money, paid out of the public's own pocket because a handful of officers had been quietly permitted, for years, to believe that some people's constitutional rights were a negotiable thing. And I made absolutely certain that number was announced plainly, out loud, in a public session, with the full reason attached to it like a tag, because a settlement paid quietly in the dark teaches no one anything at all, while a settlement paid out in the full light of day is the closest thing a broken system has ever come to an honest confession. There was a hearing, of course, and I want to tell you exactly what I did there, because it is the part of all of this that I am still not certain I got entirely right. Only that I got it as right as I knew how to, with the tools I had. Officer Kurt Rennick sat at a long table in a wood-paneled room with a union representative on one side of him and the accumulated weight of his own 9 years on the other, and he was, by that morning, a visibly smaller man than the one who had loomed over my father's footlocker in his boots. He had lost the tilt of the chin entirely. His hands were folded and still on the table in front of him. And when it came at last to my turn to speak, I did not read out the long, cold list of everything he had cost. The review board had already read it into the record, line by patient line, and it had filled the whole room like smoke you could taste. Instead, I set my prepared notes face down on the table, and I left them there. And I told them, all of them, about my father. About the number 9 bus he drove across this city for 29 years. About the thing he said to me the evening I first pinned on a badge, that the shield is a debt and not a possession, and that the day you forget you owe it is the day you should walk in and turn it in on the desk. And then I said the single hardest true thing I know how to say, which is that I did not believe Kurt Rennick had woken up that Saturday morning a monster. I believed he had woken up that Saturday exactly as he had woken up every working morning for years, and that the monster in the room with us was not the man at all but the silence that had been built up around him, brick by brick, the closed complaints, the sighing supervisors, the 11 citizens who had each been carefully taught that there was no use bleeding over it. You are responsible for what you did, I told him directly, across the room, meeting his eyes and holding them. And he looked back at me. And for the very first time since that gray corridor, I saw something move in his face that was not contempt and was not even fear, but was something nearer to shame, which is, in my long experience, the only soil that anything decent has ever managed to grow in. You are responsible, I said again, and you will answer for it, and you should answer for it, fully. But I am responsible too. This department is responsible. This chair I sit in is responsible. Because we built the road you drove down. We paved it smooth for you. We took down the signs, and we looked the other way at every turn. And then we all stood around acting surprised when a man drove it the whole way to the end. Kurt Rennick was separated from the department. I will not dress it up in soft words for anyone's comfort. He was terminated. His 9 years ended in that paneled room, and the separate matter of criminal charges was referred exactly where the law required that it be referred, out of my hands entirely and into the district attorney's office, where it belonged. Because a commissioner who prosecutes her own case in her own building is no better in the end than a commissioner who quietly buries it. But I did not stop at the man's firing, because one firing is only a headline, and a headline is not a reform, and I have watched too many headlines fade to yellow on too many walls. I ordered every closed complaint from the prior 10 years pulled out and reopened and re-reviewed, this time by a panel that included, for the first time in the entire history of the department, 3 civilians seated with real subpoena power. I rewrote the standing policy on detentions from the studs up, so that no officer in this city could ever again lay hands on another human soul without first stating aloud, on camera, the specific and articulable fact that justified it. I established the Sergeant Von Fund, named not for me, but for my father, who was a sergeant once, long ago, in a different and older uniform, to provide free legal representation to any resident of this city who believes they have been wrongly stopped, so that never, ever again would the single deciding factor in whether justice arrive be whether the citizen happened to have a lawyer already folded in their back pocket. And I sat down myself, in person, across a table from Terrence Beale. And I told him that the settlement money was the city's apology spoken in the only language a city really knows, which is money, but that mine was a different debt, owed in the language of one person to another, and I paid it to him plainly, face to face. I am sorry. We failed you, and it will not be nothing that we failed you. He was quiet for a long time, that young man, turning a paper coffee cup slowly in his hands, and then he looked up and said, "Ma'am, I honestly didn't think anybody up there even knew my name." And I told him that his one sentence was the entire disease laid bare in a single breath, and that we were going to spend the rest of my time in that office making certain that fewer and fewer people in this city ever had a reason to say it again, one honest encounter at a time. I went back to the storage unit alone on a Sunday evening a few weeks after the hearing, in the same faded charcoal sweatshirt with its frayed cuff, because there was work waiting for me there that I had left unfinished on the morning that everything happened, and I have never been a woman who leaves a thing half done. The Fairmont corridor was quiet at that late hour, emptied out, the flat gray daylight I remembered gone soft and golden as the sun dropped, the long amber bars of light lying across the concrete floor between the shadows of the roll-up doors. I raised the door of Unit 114. It rattled up its track with the same rusty music it always made, and I stood a while in the open doorway just breathing in the smell of my father's things, that particular smell of cedar and old paper and the faint machine oil ghost of a whole life spent working with two good hands. Then I knelt down in front of the footlocker, my knees complaining now the way is used to, and I turned the brass key one more time, and I lifted the heavy lid, and there it all still was, undisturbed now, protected now, safe now. The folded flag squared away in its case, the medals resting in their felt-lined box, the letters bundled in their twine. The young man of 22 grinning up out of the photograph with his whole entire face at two friends who never grew old. I had come there that evening to finish the work of moving him, to carry the last of him out to the car and closer to home. But I found, kneeling there, that I did not want to move him yet, not tonight. And I have lived long enough now to trust the things I do not want as much as the things I do. So I lowered myself down and sat on the cold concrete floor beside the open trunk with my back against the ribbed steel wall, exactly the way I used to sit as a small girl on the floor of his workshop while he told me stories out of that very same box, holding each thing up to the light before he put it back. And I let myself feel, at long last, the one thing I had not permitted myself to feel out in that corridor, or up in that top-floor office, or in that paneled hearing room with all its cameras, which was grief. Plain grief, for him, for my father, the simple, unglamorous ache of a daughter who wants her father back and cannot have him. And underneath that, something adjacent to grief for all the rest of it too, for the 11 names in the file, for the years it had taken to find them, for the boy with the phone who should never in a just world have needed to be that brave on a Saturday morning. And then, running underneath even that grief, quiet and unshakable and warm as the last of the light, there was the thing my father left to me that no officer alive could ever have dropped in the dust of a corridor, because it does not live inside a footlocker and never did. He left me the plain knowledge that dignity is not a thing that other people confer upon you, and therefore is not a thing that any of them can ever take away, that a black woman in a dead man's sweatshirt, down on her knees on cold concrete with steel on her wrists, can be, in the eyes of everything in this world that finally matters, the tallest and most upright person standing in the whole corridor. Officer Kurt Rennick believed that my worth was his alone to decide the very instant he laid eyes on me. And he was wrong, wrong all the way down, and being that wrong ended up costing him nearly everything he had. But I take no joy at all in the ledger of what it cost him, and I have looked, and I do not find it there. I take my joy instead in the fund with my father's name stamped on it, and in the 3 civilians who now sit with real power on that review panel, and in the plain fact that somewhere out in this city tonight, right now, a resident who gets pulled over and stopped is going to hear a nervous young officer state the reason for it out loud into a camera before anything else happens. Because a woman was once made to open a footlocker on a gray Saturday and chose, instead of reaching for the shield that would have saved only herself, to hold the whole thing up into the light where everyone could finally see it. I closed the lid at last. I turned the brass key until it caught. I stood up, slowly, my knees aching the exact way my father's used to ache on cold mornings, and I ran the flat of my hand once across the flaking stenciled letters on the side of the old trunk, the way you'd smooth a sleeping child's hair, and I said good night to him out loud, the way I always do, feeling only a little foolish and not caring. Then I pulled the roll-up door of Unit 114 back down over all of it, and I clicked my own small padlock shut on the latch, and I turned and walked back out through the corridor into the very last of the gold evening light with my 2 hands empty and steady and my head held level. A daughter, and a commissioner, and a citizen, in that order, always and forever in that order, carrying nothing at all out of that place but the one thing that was ever worth the carrying, which is the whole, unbroken, unhidden truth of what happened there, and of what we did about it, and of what we are going to keep on doing, one honest encounter at a time, for as long as I have breath and a chair to sit in, until the debt my father named is paid down to the last coin.